Well, for a closer look at how hosting a World Cup can impact a country's economy, I spoke with Stefan Hall. Stefan is a project and engagement lead with the World Economic Forum's Information and Entertainment Initiative. And I began by asking him who tends to benefit the most from hosting the tournament.
Advanced economies are definitely in the best position to benefit financially. Those are the economies that have the most complete infrastructure, and generally they don't need to construct new stadiums, or at the very least they probably just need to make a few minor upgrades to existing infrastructure. But the research shows that actually, over the course of the past few tournaments, whether it's a major sporting event like the World Cup or even the Olympics, it's actually very difficult for even advanced economies to turn a profit, and there is a lot of opportunity cost to hosting a major sporting event, which makes it a very complicated endeavor overall.
Now, talk about some of the misperceptions that come to when it comes to return on investment with the World Cup, because obviously it's a lot of prestige, it's a lot of attention, but in terms of return on investment, what is it that people are expecting and what's the reality?
I think most people, when their country or their city bids to host an Olympics or a World Cup, most people are expecting to see a major upgrade to the existing infrastructure, whether that's new stadiums being built or an upgrade to air, rail or other transportation links, an upgrade to accommodation facilities and infrastructure like that. And at the same time, people also anticipate an economic boost in terms of spending. People expect that there will be more tourists coming to the country, bringing in money and staying in hotels and spending money while they're visiting or watching a tournament. But the reality is actually quite different. So, even as I mentioned, for advanced economies which do not require too much investment in infrastructure, they actually don't see a lot of the benefits that people expect to see. So, in London 2012 and Beijing 2008, at those Olympics, year-on-year tourists actually went down in both those two cities. And the London audit report after the Olympics concluded that people were actually put off by things like overcrowding, price increases, and general security fears. So it's not clear that the economic returns that people expect to see on these tournaments is actually realized.
Now, with so much money flowing into the World Cup, though, does that tend to trickle down to the local economies and the broader economies of these host countries?
There have been studies that suggested that that is a case. So, for example, at the South Africa World Cup in 2010, South Africa anticipated that the World Cup would bring in about 450,000 additional tourists to the country that year. In the end, it only brought in 300,000, but those 300,000 actually did end up spending more money than the average tourist. So they spent around 25% more than the average tourist to South Africa. What's interesting, though, is that that actually came at a kind of cost of acquisition to the South African government. So the cost of attracting those tourists and the related expenditures by the government to kind of ensure everything was safe and smooth running, that actually came at a cost of somewhere between $4,000 and $13,000 per tourist. And something that's interesting to compare that with is that for the same amount of money, the South African government actually could have paid the working wages for the entire working age population for a week. So the money does, come into the country. The evidence is there for that. But whether or not that's offset by the expenditures from a host city or a host country is really quite unclear.
So since there are cheaper and more sustainable ways to invest in infrastructure in these countries, why do you think a lot of countries are still clamoring to use the World Cup as a vehicle when it comes to infrastructure?
The World Cup and in general sporting events, these are really prestige events. They're one of the few events that actually bring the entire world together. We saw at the recent Winter Olympics that there is this unifying power that sports has to bring people together. At the Winter Olympics, the North and South Korean teams marched under a common flag, and that helped pave the way for peace discussions between those two countries. There is an element of countries trying to achieve broader diplomatic goals by hosting these tournaments. But at the same time, they also want to make a statement that their countries are open for business. The New York Times has reported that countries bidding for the Olympics actually saw their trade increase after their bids, and even the host countries saw their trade increase. So it's really just a message to the world that your country or your city is open for business, and it's a good place for tourists and others to come and spend money. And as I said, although there's evidence to the contrary about whether the costs outweigh the benefit, it's really a clear message that countries are trying to send to the rest of the world.